Okay. So how did you guys feel about this milestone that you were doing today? Did you feel like things were connecting, or are there still areas where... All right, I see thumbs sideways. Give me a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a thumbs sideways. All right, cool. So let's go over it. This review is scheduled for an hour, but I think it's going to take less time than that. Yeah, I tried to do the lights, but that's just something I'm still working on, guys. Still trying to improve on. All right, so here's our README that for our assignment. So we had a component called dog card, dog list, and an app component, and a dogs.js file that had all of our different dog objects in an array. And then we also wanted to create some functionality where you click on a bark button and you see rough come up. So this was our assignment, right? So let's actually go over the component hierarchy, because we got to think about those things when we're thinking about React. So if we have app, we have dogs list, and we have dog card. That's what came with our app, right? It came with app, it came with dog list, and it came with dog card. So what do you guys think the component hierarchy would be for this, if we were to draw it out? Josh.
Let's first start with app, and then we go to the container.
App. And then if we were kind of to like do the wireframe at the same time, what does app have in it?
The container.
Okay.
Which
What
is
is that called?
Dogs list.
Dogs list. And where does that appear in our wireframe?
To the left.
Okay.
At the container. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is app, this is dogs list. Alright, we have one more thing. Anyone else? Simon?
Dog card.
Okay. Right, so we have a bunch of dog cards here, right? So each of these is a dog card. And what's the parent of dog card? Exactly. So anytime you approach any React app, think about this behavior, right? You don't necessarily have to draw the wireframe if you can envision it, but I would definitely recommend drawing the hierarchy for your code challenge, for your project, for anything. Because sometimes you might have like siblings, right? You might have something else here and then they're sharing something from a parent. So it's important to kind of draw out the hierarchy so you know what you're working with, because then it's a lot easier to actually code it out. So we don't have any siblings right now. So that said, where should we start? Raphael.
So the child of the app, which is the dog list.
So you want to start with dog list?
Yes.
Okay. Any other ideas? Simon.
Start at the very top app.
Okay. Why?
Because we need to import each child.
Okay.
We make sure it's there.
All right, so that's something we can touch on during this review, like how to make sure that things are connected. Right now, when I go on my app, things are already broken, which is not a very good sign. This is what you guys are given for your starter code, right? And I'll make sure I have my tools open. Like, this doesn't look very pretty. It looks a little bit scary. So I usually would recommend starting from the highest level component and kind of make sure things are connected all the way through. So if we were to start an app, how would I make sure that dogs list is connected to app? Roman? We do need to import. All right. So let's see. So this is inside of containers. All right, cool. How else can I check that it's connected?
You need to go to dogs list and see if it's exporting.
Yeah, there's a dogs list here. This is exporting. How else can I check that it's actually on the page? Because I don't really see anything. I don't really have any feedback right now that's telling me that this component is connected. Ka?
You can console log it.
You could. You can console log something in here. Where's the best place to console log? Right here?
Yeah.
Right here?
No, that's
It would have to be in the render.
It would have to be in the render. Why?
Because that's what it's initially going to do when you open page scan render. That console out later.
I mean, that's kind of the reason. The reason it can't just be out here is because with classes, things have to be inside of functions, right? We can't just have random code out here. So yeah, we can console log hello world. And if it comes up, then we know our component is connected. One of my favorite ways to do it actually is to put something here, like hello world. And if that shows up on the page, it's like, bam, I know that it's connected. All right. What should we do next? Now we know that our dogs list is connected. What do we want to do from there? Raphael?
get all the dogs.
Okay. How do I get all of the dogs?
You have to basically import. You have to import the dogs from the doc.js.
Okay. So import some dogs from dogs.js. And let's actually see what this file looks like so we know what we're working with. So we have an array of dog objects. It's being exported correctly. So in theory, this should work, right? How can we check that we have our dogs?
In the import, shouldn't it be capital D instead of, I think, well, that doesn't,
This one?
yeah, it doesn't matter, but I usually do it.
So this just says how I want to name it. So I'm taking the export default from this file, and the export default from this file is this entire array. And then in this component, I'm just choosing to name it dogs, but I'm taking whatever was export defaulted from this file. That's all?
Answer your question earlier, you can console log dogs to save it all.
Okay. So I like to label arguments, especially when you're working with React and you have lots of things that you're console logging throughout your app. That tends to help so you know what you're console logging at any given time. So let's see if this works. So what's going on? How do we debug this? It's not happy with me. Miles?
Dogs sit in the same directory, the your relevant path of it, so you have to change it so that it goes up one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And were you able to figure that out from this error, or you just noticed it before?
I figured, well, I didn't notice it when you were doing it, but when I saw that it resolved it, I realized that it's probably because it's not in the same folder.
Exactly. Yeah. So whenever you see errors like this, like can't resolve, and it's a file name, then that's a good indication that maybe you didn't link the files correctly. This might happen a lot to you in React. All right, cool. So how do we link these files correctly? Josh?
You can go into the import. I did dot. So
Okay.
I was able to like go to the folder.
All right, cool. Because we're inside of container, so we need to step out into source, and then we have access to dogs. So let's see if it works now. Boom. We have a nice label. We know these are the dogs. We can investigate what one dog object looks like. Pretty useful stuff, right? Now what do we want to do with these dogs? Roman?
I would create state. Set state dog list.
Okay. Why?
Because I'm gonna wanna iterate through and use that information.
Mm-hmm.
So not 100%.
Yeah.
Why I can't just directly iterate, but
You can.
you can.
In this case, you can directly iterate because you're just taking this information from a file. But in the future, you guys are going to be like fetching from an API and you're not going to have data readily available. You're going to have to wait until your component mounts and then you're going to fetch data from the API and put it on your state. So it's a good habit to get into to set data on your state right away, right? So how would I set this on my state? Raphael?
Your state equals curly braces, all dogs equals dogs. No.
Okay. All right, cool. So now I have this thing connected. If we wanted to, we could also just name it dogs, right? And we wouldn't even need to put the colon because of what reason? Why can we do this and it would still work?
Magic.
Magic? That's a valid theory. Jeff?
Well, isn't that when you name the key the same as the
Yeah,
variable or whatever value?
exactly. So this is the same as this, right? Because when you have a variable that's named the same as the key, you can use a shortcut, right? This will work too. All right. Let's see. Computed properties or something? I thought it was a branch of destructuring, but apparently it's unrelated to destructuring, as I found out through Graham's lecture. But yeah, I think it's called computed properties. How can we actually check our state? Simon. Where?
The render.
Always in the render. All right. Yeah? All right, cool. So we see that our dogs are in state. All right, let me ask you guys this. What the heck is going on here? Is this like a global variable? What is this state equals? Miles?
It's just what's called syntax sugar or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like that constructor function. That
Exactly.
does,
Exactly.
Except it's just a shorthand, so that it's easy to write.
Exactly. Today I've seen a few people doing some interesting things, like setting variables here. Like let dogs equals something, and then trying to console log them, and that doesn't work. And that doesn't work because we need to have functions when we're inside of a class. We can't like randomly put variables inside of our class. So even though this deceptively looks like it's a variable, it's actually syntactic sugar for a constructor function. So actually, how would you write that constructor function instead of the shorthand for state? Because it is something you will encounter when you become developers and you need to know like what it means and how to work with it. Will, do you know?
It's a constructor, and then you normally want to pass it props as an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And then curly braces, you also pass props to super.
Mm-hmm. And then? Raphael?
I think it's
This, that
this,
state.
yeah.
And then?
Equals an object. You could put like dogs and all.
Yeah. So this is like the non-syntactic sugar version of writing state. In case you encounter that, That's what this means. We actually don't need to include props in this state. The only time we include props is if we're actually using props inside of our state. But if you're not using it, you don't need to include props. Some people like to include it anyway, just to be safe. But if we're console logging our state, we can see that it works exactly the same way. So these are two different versions to set your state. All right, now we have our array of dogs on our state, and we're trying to achieve this behavior, right? So where do I go from here? Lizelle, where do I go from here? Tell me more. Tell me more about mapping the dogs.
I guess you have to make a new variable inside of render.
You can.
But it would be dogs. No, this dot state dot dogs.
This dot state dot dogs.
Right, that way you're not directly accessing dot map.
Dot map.
Yeah.
Something like this. All right, and what are we gonna put inside of our map? Who can help me out here? I don't know React, please help. Raphael.
Okay, so you put a callback function in there.
Okay,
So
and
you will put single dog,
mm-hmm.
and then arrow function. You will use the dog card in there.
Okay.
So you have to import it.
Yeah, what is dog card? Where's this coming
As a
from?
component, child component for dog lists.
Yeah, right here. So if we ever want to use this component, we do need to import it. So let's do that. And where am I importing it from?
So we use dog list, beat that to get out of there,
Mm-hmm.
and then go into the components, and then
Yeah. All right, cool.
Is it going to work?
No, it's not gonna work. Now it's gonna work. How do we check that this works? Or do we need to do anything else to make this work? Miles?
Well, I guess, I think it's already in there, but we should make sure that there's an export in the dog card as well.
Okay. There's an export default here. Cool. But I still don't see anything, so. Raphael?
so go back to the. Okay, so you will have to put map dogs, put them inside the div on the return curly braces.
Here.
Yes.
Will this work? Who thinks I'll see something? All right. Tell me more, Simon. You raised your hand. You said, do you think I'll see something on my browser?
Yeah.
What will we see on our browser?
Map dogs.
Okay. What's mapped dogs?
Map dogs is the dog card for each of the dogs.
Yes. So it's an array of what exactly? Of dog cards. Okay. And what's in each dog card?
There's nothing in each of these dog cards.
So there's nothing in here.
We'll see.
Will we see anything?
We'll see containers of nothing.
We'll see containers of nothing. Okay. Any other guesses? Lizelle says buttons. Okay. What's your reasoning, Lizelle?
It's basically a bunch of empty dog cards, and if you look at what this is returning, only the button can successfully go through. without
Yeah.
returning dogs.
Exactly. And how many buttons should we see?
How many dogs?
Exactly. So Lizelle gets a point. We get some buttons here. All right, cool. So this doesn't really help us out. This doesn't help us with this functionality, right? So what do we need to do next to get a little bit closer to our goal? Raphael?
Okay, so go back to the dog list.
Mm-hmm.
Not that one. This one. Okay,
This one?
So to the dog card, you have to pass props to it, which would be the state.
And how do I pass props? What is passing props even for? Miles?
Passing prompts so you can give information from a parent to a child.
Okay, cool. What kind of information do we care about giving in this case? Like, what does each dog card need in order to successfully show some information? Josh?
It's the name and image.
All right, it needs a name and an image. Okay. Lizelle?
Each dog card needs to know what dog is trying to showcase.
Exactly. So, that said, how should I pass these props? Raphael?
So be dog equal curly braces, a single dog.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different options. Like, there's a lot of different ways to do this. If we wanted to, we could actually pass separate pieces of information. We can pass, like, the name prop separately from the image prop if we wanted to. But I think this works pretty well. So now we can pass a dog object to each dog card. So how can we check that it's been successful, that we actually passed a dog object? Roman?
Go to dog card and fill in this dot props, dot name.
We could. What about before that? What if I don't want to spend time filling in all these different properties? I just want to see if my dog went through. Jonathan, do you know? How can I check that my prop, dog, actually came through to my child component? Mm-hmm. Console log what? I want to see all my props. How do I see the props of this component? Exactly. There we go. All right. Who thinks we'll see a dog? Who thinks we'll see 4 dogs? Who thinks we'll see an empty object? Let's find out. Props. Yeah, so we're getting props for every single dog card that we're rendering. Looks pretty good, eh? There is one thing. Has anyone run into this error before? Does anyone know what this error is talking about? Does anyone know how to solve this error? Ka.
It needs to create a key for each of the dog. So inside the map.
Okay.
Where the dog
Here?
is created.
Here? Here?
So on the left arrow.
Here?
A little bit.
Okay.
So like map parentheses, it should have another parentheses for dog and the index.
Where?
The first dog.
This?
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're... Okay. Yeah, we could do it this way. This is another valid way to do it. And then...
Inside you can pass out key index.
So what does this do for us? What does dog/index do? Why can we even do this?
Next is going to be a number for each of the dog. So it's going to be
Yeah. So with .map in JavaScript, this is just a JavaScript thing. This is not a React thing. When you have a callback function for your .map, the parameters that your callback function takes is the element you're iterating over, and also optionally you can pass the index, right? So this is just a JavaScript thing. But in React, anytime you use map and you're trying to have an array of React components, you need to provide the key index or else you're going to get that error. And I think there's a blog post about it that Tashawn can send out, but it's basically to keep React knowing like which element is which. Otherwise, things could go funky if you don't use it, but I've never had things go funky without using it. So now that error is gone. Another way that we could do it if you didn't use index is since each dog has a unique ID, we could also pass dog.id if we wanted to. All right. So right now, we still don't have any information rendering about each dog. But we've checked that this .props for every dog card has a dog key on it, and that dog key has all the different properties of the dog. So what do I need to do? I want to build my dog card to look like this. What do I need to do in my dog card component? Rafael?
So in the H2, you will do curly braces, meet this props, dog, lead.
Mm-hmm.
And then for this image would be this props, dog, this ing.
Okay. Let's see what happens. Boom. It works. All right. What's going on with this error? How do I fix this so that it's not yelling at me? Does that?
Normally, I think the error is saying that normally inside it all has to be a callback function.
Yeah, so I just don't want it to yell at me right now, so I'm just going to get rid of that. All right. So we have all our dogs. What if I didn't want to type this.props.dog every single time? Is there anything I can do to make that easier and less repetitive? What was that? Yeah, I am talking about destructuring. So how would I do that? How would I destructure this?
Before the return,
Mm-hmm.
you would write something like const and then curly braces.
Okay. And then?
The keys of dog.
So the ones we're using here are name and image. Yeah.
Put name, comma, ing, and set that equal to this .props dog.
Cool. So now I can get rid of this. Works. Is anyone confused about destructuring? Or are we okay with destructuring now? This is something you'll frequently see in React, especially when you get to functional components and you start passing in props into functions. It can be very annoying to keep writing this.props.something. So this is just a shorter way to declare your variables, right? So now I don't have to write this.props every single time. All right, cool. So we have all this stuff. We're just missing the click functionality. So any ideas about how to approach it? And just as a reminder, when we click bark, it should pop up and show rough for that dog. And when we click it again, the rough should go away. Any ideas of what I would need to make this happen? Raphael?
Need state.
Okay. Why do I need state?
Because you need to be able to toggle between. So you need a
Mhm.
state, so you can have it set up as true or false.
Mhm.
And depending on what it is, it will render this
Mhm.
or that.
And which component does it make sense to put this toggle state into? This one? Why this one?
That's the one that needs to know about.
Exactly, because this is the component that's going to have the rough. So it's the only one that cares about it, right? Okay. So let's give it a state. What do we want to name the property in our state? Clicked. And what should I set it to?
False.
All right, why false? Like, how is this going to come into play? Well?
We're gonna put an on click on the button.
Mm-hmm.
And the on click will toggle the clicks
Mhm.
back and forth using the set state method. And whether or not rough is displayed will be dependent on whether or not that's true or false.
I love it. Really good explanation. All right, so heard some good things. Giving on-click a callback. So let's actually write that callback. What should I name it? Rough? Sure. Now what? Let's see. Does anyone else know? I know you gave the premise for everyone will.
So is this rough function what is being called when the click happens?
Yeah, so the idea is to invoke it here. So how would I invoke this rough function here? Raphael?
You want to call it so be this, and the on click this dot and the name of that rough.
Yeah, and it's important not to invoke it, right? Because if we were to invoke it, it would run every time. But we only want this function to run when the click happens. Alternatively, you could do something like this if you wanted to. Right? Well,
Don't we have to bind this to rough in the on click?
here we don't need to bind. That's something we're going to get into a little bit later with React, but a lot of the time, if you're passing a function from one component to the other, you want to bind this, because your this context will change from one component to the other. But in this case, we're just using rough inside of this component, so we don't need to worry about that. And also, secretly, I'm using an arrow function here anyway, which will bind this anyway. Yeah. All right, cool. How do we check that this rough function will hit when we click bark? Raphael?
You can put a console log in the function to see if it fires.
Great. Let's do that. There's a fire. Cool. It's working. All right, so what do we want this rough function to do? Because we don't want it to just console log fire. Jeff, do you know?
So you put clicked, that's your key,
So put clicked.
yeah, colon,
Mm-hmm.
and then this dot state, put a bang in front of it,
Okay.
dot click.
This is a good start. So it looks like you're trying to change the state here.
Yeah.
We're missing a few
Oh
things.
wait. Oh, I'm sorry. That has to be inside of this dot set state.
All right. What does this dot set state do for us?
It sets the state.
Yeah, it changes the state, and what else? A very key thing that
Oh, it re-renders.
it also causes the render function to fire again, right? And is this the right syntax for this dot set state?
No. You have to put curly braces inside the parentheses. Like
Yeah.
yeah, like that.
So you have to give it an object.
Yeah.
And then you can put in any of the keys that are on state and then how you want to change them. All right, cool. Are we going to be able to see the changes? Let's actually console log our state so we can actually see these changes live. I'm a big believer in like every time you write a line of code, see if you can test it. Because the worst thing you can do is write an entire React app without testing that things work, and then things are broken and you have no idea where to start. So if I did something to change my state, I want to check that my state actually changed. So my state is coming out as false. If I click bark, then I have a state that says true, and I'm like, yes, confirmed, this works. So now what? I'm successfully changing my state. How do I get the rough to show up? Menachem, do you know?
Sure. What you could do is, this is what I did. Underneath the button tag, you can add a JavaScript ternary.
Okay.
And inside of the ternary, you could put a h1 tag that says rough.
So how does the ternary come into play?
So you could open curly brackets.
Okay.
And then in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
type this dot state dot click
Mm-hmm.
question mark, and then you want, yeah, that's good. And then after the closing h1 tag, put a colon, and then an empty string.
You could do that. All right. So what is this basically saying for us, this ternary? Who can explain how this ternary works? Raphael?
So if that condition, what comes before the question mark, if that is true, it will return you the what's between the question mark and the colon. Or else it will return whatever's after the colon.
All right, cool. So let's check this out. We get our rough. It goes away. It works for multiple dogs. Cool. The only thing about this is that we're forcing it to show something anyway, even if it's not true. There's actually a shortcut to do this a different way. Any ideas? Putting null here? You could do that. Usually I would say anytime you see a pattern like this where otherwise you're rendering null, there's a different kind of operator you can use that would be more useful. I know you know this, Lizelle, because you asked me about this. Do you want to tell us?
Sure, but I'm not completely clear on exactly why it works.
Okay.
You can put, instead of the whole ternary, inside the curly braces, you put this dot state dot clicked and
Yeah.
the h1.
So let's like have both versions so we can compare them. It's not easy to comment things out in JSX. Yeah, so this basically gets rid of the null for us. Because if you have a component like this where either I'm going to show it or I'm going to show null, then it's a scenario where you can use an AND. And so what the AND does, basically the logical operator will check the left side first, and if this is true, then this code will run. But if it's false, this is not going to run. It's not going to show this h1 at all. And it's a very common pattern in React to do something like that.
Can I ask why it works? Because if you look inside the curly braces,
Mhm.
it kind of looks like it'll evaluate to either like true or false. So why does it actually evaluate itself instead of saying like true or false?
I think it always would evaluate to something truthy. Not necessarily true or false, but like a truthy value.
No, I mean like exactly what we wrote there is usually what you put inside like an if something and.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
You can do that in an if statement with something that doesn't evaluate to true or false. You can do it with something that evaluates to a truthy value. So if you have something that's not an empty string, even in an if statement, you can say if string and something else. So it's not saying that the string evaluates to true or false, but that there's a truthy value. Miles?
I think what she's asking is why instead of evaluating to true, that evaluates the H1 with rough.
So I think it's just the fact about the code running, not that it's like evaluating to something, right? So Sean?
Essentially, it's saying to return true and return H1. Right?
Yeah.
So what does true actually look like on the top? Nothing, right? So the only visual effect that the user is getting is that H1, right? But if the first argument returns false, then it's not going to bother reading the rest of that argument because we need for both to be true due to like the end.
Right.
So it's essentially saying it'll return true and it'll return H1, but enable for it to get to return that H1, the first argument has to return true as well. And that's what it is. Right. So the first argument just happens to return something that has no visual impact on it.
Because the way actually that the computer reads your code when you have ands, even in something like an if statement, is it won't even go to this side if this side is false. So because this side is true, it's going to go to this side and it's going to render this. All right.
It's the same thing with the board, right? If the left
Yeah.
side is false, it won't even bother looking at the right side.
We'll actually go to
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
But
it's a similar idea,
Yeah.
but it's the opposite. Only if the first side is false, it's going to go to the other side. But if you have an or and the first side is true, it's not going to bother going to the other side because it already found that one of these things is true. All right. So right now our rough kind of appears underneath. There is a way that you can have it appear next to it. Does anyone have a good idea of how to do that? Miles?
Well, I don't know if this is cheating, but I noticed in the CSS there was a class that was set up for it. It's called .bark. So if you just give
Yeah.
H1 a bark, that bark class, it moves it over.
Maybe. I did it with the flexbox. You can probably do it that way. So how would you do it that way? I have to give something a class called bark?
Yeah, you just have to give it the H1. You have to do class name equals bark.
That would make sense, because I was like, why do I have to use a flexbox for this? Oh, that's really nice. Yeah, that's definitely better than my way. Does anyone want to know the flexbox way of doing this? So flexboxes are super useful, PSA announcement. Anytime that you want anything to render next to each other, as opposed to underneath each other, it's a good time to use flexbox. So if we have something like the image, and we wanted the bark to render next to the image or something, then we can put a div around it. This would be useful for your projects too. And if we give this a class name of whatever we want, so maybe dog, rough, or something like that. In our CSS, if we were to style this with a display flex, what it's going to do is it's going to take the items inside of this class. So the two items inside of this class are image and the H1, and it's going to put them next to each other. So that's like another way that you could do it. Yeah? All right. Any questions? I feel like we've covered everything. Ka?
So rough, that's a function, right?
Rough is a function, yes.
What's the reason why we don't need a variable name?
Why we don't want
A
what?
variable name like let or const.
Here?
Yeah.
Because you can't have variables randomly inside of your class name or inside of your class. This is a JavaScript class. But there's you can only have functions inside of your class, and this is the syntactic sugar way of having functions. I think normally, if you weren't to use syntactic sugar, it would be something like this.rough is a function. Any other questions? Miles?
So you were saying if you wanted to not do it that way, you'd have to do this dot rough and
I-
then have this equal
think so. You might have to look it up. I know there's a new class syntax for functions where you can just literally do this and define a function. So you could, if you wanted to, do it this way. But this would not be an arrow function. And if you weren't to bind this and try to pass this function to a different component, things would break. But here, we're just using this function within the same component, so it shouldn't cause any issues. Or maybe it does. Hmm?
This keyword, we don't have to dive into it.
Yeah, let's not worry about this right now.
The important thing here is, let's not confuse this class with an actual JavaScript function. If I'm writing a function, I can declare variables inside of a function.
Yeah.
But this is a JavaScript class, which essentially means that it's closures inside of closures inside of closures. Right? Which means that what we're creating on it are attributes, not variables. So if I'm inside of an object and I need to create a key, I give that attribute by putting the key name, right? I don't say let key equals, right? That'll break. So JavaScript class is an object inside an object. When we're creating state, when we create a function, we're adding an attribute to this object, which is a class.
Yeah. It gets very metaphysical too, because class itself is syntactic sugar in JavaScript, where secretly this whole thing is a function anyway.
Important to know though that that's not a function of React, it's a function of JavaScript.
Yeah.
Whether you're doing React or just plain old JS, you would not be able to do let raw.
Mm-hmm. All right. Cool. Any other questions? All right. Nice work, everyone.